Welcome back to Recommended Daily Value. Today, back with Kathleen Stewart. Kathleen, how are we doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. All right, so today we're going to talk a bit about carbs and the need for increasing your maintenance, but also kind of our issues with some dietary strategies. So where do you want to start here?
Let's talk about maintenance first. We kind of briefly touched on this last time about not being, you know, that we don't want people to be in a prolonged deficit. But I think if we can go a little bit more into the specific reasons why, I think that would be great. So I think, kind of briefly to give an overarching theme to this, the reasons would be, the first one would be metabolic adaptation. Next would be hormonal and reproductive health, which kind of goes under metabolic adaptation. Then there's muscle retention and performance, also like connective tissue considerations. And then psychological and behavioral considerations. Micronutrient sufficiency, that's a huge one for us that we really focus on with Transform, about hitting the theoretical RDAs. And then just like long-term sustainability of fat loss. So is there one that you want to start with first, or we just go?
Yeah. Let's start with the first one, which you said
Metabolic
was
adaptation.
metabolic adaptation. So can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so in a deficit, you have a lot of things obviously that are changing, and the most one of the biggest ones that everyone always talks about is your basal metabolic rate. And so when you're in a deficit, your basal metabolic rate, that's basically the rate at which you just exist. So if you were to lay in bed all day long and just exist, this is your BMR essentially. So it's like
How many
the
calories you burn if you
minimum.
didn't move an inch throughout the day?
Yeah, like the minimum required to keep you alive. And so in a deficit, the BMR does decrease, especially specifically in proportion to the amount of weight that you're losing decreases. Now, you do also see a little bit more of a decrease than you would theoretically expect based off of just the weight. However, we do know now, and the research continues to show this, that once you bring someone back up to a maintenance, their BMR recovers. Now, it's still going to be lower than what it was because you have lost weight. So that makes sense, right? There's like less physical mass of you to keep alive. And so, of course, your BMR is going to be lower. You go from like 300 pounds to 200 pounds, like that's a significant amount of weight loss, right? And so, of course, your BMR is going to be lower. And I think a lot of people just don't understand this fact, or like
Yeah.
they gloss over it, or they think that that shouldn't be possible. But I mean, to me, that's like a very straightforward thing. I don't know what people are missing about that. And
Yeah.
especially the whole recovery thing of like once you're back at maintenance.
Oh, I want to add something here real quick because there's also, to briefly cover metabolism, there's really four components. Your basal metabolic rate, which is kind of like your organ fuel. It's to keep you alive, but it's really just your organs, not including your digestive organs for the most part, somewhat. Then there's thermic effect of food, so that's kind of the cost of digestion. Then there's exercise, and then there's non-exercise activity thermogenesis, both of which significantly decline as you lose weight because largely sometimes we move a lot less as we go deeper into a deficit, which we'll cover. But also, when you go for a mile walk at 300 pounds versus 200 pounds, you're saving a lot of energy when you're at 200 pounds, which can be in some sense detrimental because now you're eating, you can't eat as many calories.
Exactly. Yeah, we see huge need drop-offs. And like if anything, a lot of people that say, "Oh, I can eat whatever I want and I never gain weight," a lot of it's because they have such high needs. Like I think there was one research article showing someone had like upwards of 1,000 calories burned from just NEAT alone. So just like going like this throughout the day and stuff. And we see this in the Minnesota starvation experiment where they talk about how the men develop like scoliosis, and they basically are seen to never move, like to as they're getting deep within the cut, unless they like absolutely have to, because like they were supposed to walk like 21 miles a week, so about like 3 miles, 21, 22 miles a week, so like about 3 miles a day, which is like really not all that much, especially for if you're actually like hitting your 8,000 steps, depending upon your stride length and stuff, of course.
Yeah.
And they
That's
then they
about
also had to do
6,000
like,
steps a day, right?
yeah, yeah.
Usually
For me, it's a
2,000
little
steps per
bit
mile.
more because, yeah, for me, it's a little bit more because I'm 5 feet tall. But for my husband, yeah, and for you, like definitely. And yeah, so and yeah, they would just be resting. I mean, I remember when I was deep in the LEA, like would be just like resting on everything. I would be up against the wall, like literally everything. So NEAT is like a huge thing. And then you also, obviously, when it comes to metabolic adaptation, you see the downregulation of things like thyroid hormone, leptin. You see increased muscle efficiency, and so it's basically like the nervous system, the way that it signals to like the central motor commands and stuff, it's like only you will move and like that's it, like nothing else, it becomes a way more efficient. And
That is
so when you
interesting.
return, yeah, and then so when you return to maintenance, that all of these things eventually restore themselves. Now, again, it can take some time, especially things like NEAT, thyroid hormone, leptin. Well, leptin can actually be pretty quickly, especially if you're having sufficient carbohydrates, especially like more of the glucose side. So, like more starchy carbs, people tend to find that helps to recover leptin a little bit, more quickly. But so, yeah, so these things do recover, but it can take time. And so, we typically find that the negative metabolic adaptations happen way more quickly than you see the positive metabolic adaptations occur.
Which essentially means your metabolism lowers a lot faster than you can raise it, or at least safely raise it without gaining weight.
Exactly. I mean, we know with like the overfeeding studies and stuff like that, like, just because you overeat X amount of calories, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to put on, the equivalent amount of body fat, because there's adaptive thermogenesis and all that stuff. But if you like keep doing that, then you will start to put on more and more body fat. And so, with our build group, which we have like a small, group offshoot of Transform with our build group, and we do have them in a very small caloric surplus to see if we can drive the positive adaptations a little bit more quickly, but always with the understanding that you're probably going to put on a little bit of fat in the process. The way that we have it structured, it's a very, very slow, small surplus. So the amount of fat versus like muscle gain, the goal of that is to be limited, but there's still going to be a little bit because you are in a surplus. So, but yeah, if we can use that to increase someone's threshold a little bit more quickly, I think that is a really great tool. It's just a really hard sell, especially for so many people when they're like, I have all this weight to lose. Like, why would I go into a surplus, and I agree, for a lot of people, it's definitely not the place for them currently.
Yeah. Okay, so number 3. We talked
Two,
about
two,
hormones and metabolic.
reproductive health.
Okay, reproductive health.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think many people who've been in any amount of, low energy availability, non-energy sufficiency, have experienced some type of suppression of sex hormones. So testosterone, estrogen, progesterone being obviously the big three. And, there's obviously amenorrhea and, the decline in testosterone production across the world. I think this is seen. And again, the LEA, we don't only classify as like total calories, we also classify in terms of like micronutrients and stuff too. And so this is where things like sufficient zinc comes in for testosterone, et cetera. So, and with the change in hormonal health, you obviously then see change to reproductive function, things like erectile dysfunction, changes in mood. And because Dr. Kathleen Adalton, I think, did an amazing job showing how like progesterone and the woman's cycle, like, really, you see big changes in mood, and like not only your mood, but like how other people relate to you and stuff, based off of probably pheromones or some other signaling that we don't necessarily know about right now, or like fully understand. But like, as the cycle's going on, if you don't necessarily have those changes, then you don't necessarily have the changes in the way that you relate to yourself, other people relate to you, all of that stuff. And so, you see all the time where a woman is quote unquote estrogen dominant, but both estrogen and progesterone, so both estradiol and progesterone, are just in the floor. So basically, like, serum, they are estrogen dominant, but by the serum, they're both low. And so, that's a problem. And then like the question becomes, okay, is the estrogen just hanging out in the tissues? But if it is hanging out in the tissues, like why? Like, why is the body unable to pull it out and signal to it and stuff like that, or get rid of it, right? Like, why do we have insufficient glucuronidation, for example, to get rid of it? So yeah, so you see you see the changes to, direct to the testes, direct to the ovaries, direct to the adrenal glands, and then also to the pituitary hypothalamus. So pretty much all up and down the chain.
And a lot of these things are also, which was probably my most fascinating takeaway from the MSC podcast series you guys did, is literally the organs are changing in size, right? So I
Right.
don't know about the testes, but you spoke ad nauseum about like the intestines lost a significant portion. The liver loses some. The brain is and the heart, I believe, are the most protected. But do you know
Yeah.
were the testes and the ovaries also? Were they show? I don't know if they could measure that, but maybe they
Yeah, I
could.
think that's where they go into that more, I believe, during the special topics. But I do think that they did see some contractile of the testes, and not only necessarily contractile, but like when they talked about some of the like concentration camps victims and stuff, they talked about like changes to like the Leydig cells and stuff, and so like actual physical changes to the cells themselves. And then obviously talked a lot about like changes to the mammary glands and ability to produce breast milk. I they did, I think, talk a little bit about the ovaries, but not as much because they just didn't have as much, data about the ovaries as things like the testes and even the mammary gland. So
Yeah, that would make sense considering it was all dudes in the experiment.
yeah,
But
yeah, all the stuff about women was, basically case studies and stuff. So
okay, very
yeah,
interesting. Too
but
bad
yeah,
we couldn't have starved women for 6 months. It's unethical, I guess. Just kidding.
that would never be allowed nowadays. That's for sure.
Yeah,
But
no,
again,
the whole thing is
when we're
nuts.
back in energy sufficiency, you see these starts to come back online. Now, is there a tipping point where there's so much damage that's been done that you can't come back online? I mean, there's probably an argument for that, but I think with most people, you're so far from that you should just act as if you have not crossed that tipping point. Still, like, have faith and belief in yourself, basically, and still like try to do the best you can. Like, don't look at yourself as like a lost cause, because there's for the vast majority of people, I think there's always coming back. So
Yeah,
and
that's
the thing about energy sufficiency really fast is that just because you've re-entered your quote unquote bottom end of your maintenance range, that doesn't mean that you're like out of the LEA because of things like the micronutrients and stuff. And so that's why it is important, again, to spend time building up your total calories, focusing on micronutrient dense foods, etc., in order to make sure that you're actually reaching the theoretical RDAs, let alone like rebuilding your stores, all that stuff. So
yeah. So real quick, and I can do this too because you've been talking. Um, and just let you catch your breath. But can we differentiate between energy sufficiency and low energy availability? Because what you just said, which I know seems counterintuitive to many, essentially means that you can be at energy sufficiency, which means that you are maintaining your weight, you're not gaining or losing. You're always gaining or losing, you're really never maintaining. But like on average, over a period of time, your weight's staying the same, but you're also in a low energy availability state. So square that circle for me, please, Kathleen.
yeah, I think like the functional medicine doctors and stuff, and like the quote unquote alternative health, I think they're seeing this with things like the organic acids test and some of these functional tests where they're showing like overt micronutrient deficiencies and stuff. And so in that case, there's that, even with the more allopathic tests, like, running like serum B12, for example, and seeing like overt B12 deficiency, like, so that's a big one. Or like maybe you don't run, or maybe serum B12 is fine, but you run methylmalonic acid, and that shows like an overt, that's one that they'll run in standard like allopathic medicine. So but again, this is like if people consider the micronutrient status as part of what classifies the low energy availability state. So I think you have the micronutrient side. I also think that you have the hormonal side. So like, are you in like a red ETS state, a relative energy deficiency of sport? So you're having like changes to your HPA, your HPO, or your HPT, so your hypothalamus pituitary adrenal, hypothalamus pituitary testes, hypothalamus pituitary ovary. Like, are you having changes to LH, FSH that are like consistent with REDS, the LEA? I think that would be another way of seeing it. Um,
But there's also, which you talked about, the just you're not eating enough too. Like and then
right.
this is related to red S as well, but like you're just we've seen, and we have women currently in the group that are maintaining their weight on 1,200 to 1,300 calories, which is just not enough to fuel a grown adult for a long period of time without running into issues. So things eventually do shut down. And it's very counterintuitive because, like, when you see it, you're like, they should be losing 10 pounds a week. Like, they should just be rail thin and losing a ton of weight. Some of them, they come into the program like saying, I need to lose weight, which is not always the case. Sometimes it
Right.
is the case. But yeah, it's very counterintuitive.
Yeah, and obviously, research has put numbers on it. I obviously really like the 35 calories per kilogram because that's where I constantly find when it's like, okay, we're finally out of the LEA mark for most people, especially in regards to micronutrients, hormonal status, etc. But some research will put it at 30, somewhere around 30 basically is where a lot of the research will put it. But there's also research talking about like insufficient carbohydrates and an LEA from insufficient carbohydrates, which I know is like very challenging for like the carnivore keto side of the world. But then there's also on the flip side, like obviously if you have insufficient amino acids coming in, then you're going to have an issue there too. And so micronutrients also involves like the macronutrients too, of course.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's why I don't think, like I don't think that you could just give someone, straight up TPN, total parental nutrition, to like pull them out of the LEA state, right? Like I think that's why a lot of people in the ICU, et cetera, like really start to meet their downfall because they are, obviously they're doing the best that they can with what they have, right? If someone is not conscious, you have to do the best you can with what you have. But they really are just really keeping them barely alive at that point, at a point, because there's so much more involved than just, there's so much more involved with the food matrix and, just like giving someone straight up dextrose versus fiber and all these other things that come with carbohydrates, polyphenols, like all of that. And then same thing with the proteins, same thing with the fats, all of that stuff. So, yeah, I think the LEA, a lot of people kind of like have bashed it because they're looking at it straight from a caloric standpoint when again we provide so much more nuance to it. It's not just total calories, and it's just
Yeah.
like calories in, calories out. It's like, okay, just because you fundamentally will really never be able to fully account for everything, it doesn't matter because at the end of the day the error washes out and you can still use these as proxies and all that stuff. So I think that's where a lot of the arguments come from is basically when someone uses a term, they mean it one way, but when we use a term, we mean it another way. So that's why we try to define as we go.
Yeah. Not use ambiguous language.
Yeah,
And to summarize this, essentially, you can be consuming enough energy, but not be producing enough. And that
exactly.
can be a result of lack of micronutrients, a lack of, it could be exercise, a lack of muscle mass, a lack of macronutrients, so not enough protein, carbs, or fat, any of the, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, etc., which is where we see a lot of people.
Yeah, and then add the lifestyle things, right? Like sunlight and circadian rhythm and sleep, and we were just talking about like deep sleep and REM sleep and all of that stuff. So it's not, I think a lot of people come into transform just expecting the like food side and like maybe a little bit of the movement side, not realizing how much of again it will all encompassing, except for again maybe the psycho-emotional side because we're not therapists or psychiatrists or psychologists, right? But it is very, other than that, it's like very all encompassing, and because it is, all of these things are important for health. So
Could you briefly recap your Substack on category errors? Because I thought that was, everyone should go check it out. We'll link it, but I thought it was so good and very useful right now.
yeah, I so the other day I like wrote something on my Instagram about how people are making category errors, and then Tyler was basically like, you should just write up a Substack about this and like make it actually be more long lasting than just like an Instagram story, because I always just put things on my Instagram story. So if you're not there within 24 hours, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to write more like actually on Substack so it's lingers more. But anyway, so like a category error is basically like you say like the sky smells good or something. So you attribute one category to a different category, and they're really not meant to be, attributed. They're not meant to be correlative. Like, now you might associate a smell with the sky, personally, but that doesn't mean that, making this broad claim is not a category error. And so when it comes to things like, health, well, really everything, like, people make category errors all over the place, and they think, because, we've talked about this before, but because, the sunlight piece was like your crucial missing piece that like solved all of your issues and stuff, that must mean that is everyone's crucial missing piece. And it's like, no, the reason why we talk about like slices of the pie, so the biochemistry, biophysics, biomechanics, or like movement basically, and then psycho-emotional, and then you can add other ones in there like soul, spirit, and other things. The reason why we talk about that is because some people are really crushing it on certain slices of their pie, and they don't need to focus on that anymore. They need to focus on these other slices of the pie and bring them up. Or sometimes there are times in our life where we have to leverage like the slices of the pie that we can leverage, that we do really well in, to like get us through, like a bridge and stuff. But eventually you do want to focus on these other ones. But yeah, so to sum it up, like, basically people, they create a survivorship bias, a self-fulfilling prophecy of like, this was my solution, so this must be your solution. And again, that in and of itself is a category error. So we'll have to link that post.
Yeah. I'm going to read a part of it because I like it so much. And I'll steal your thunder because I know you, Kathleen and I are both better with the written word. We at least believe than speaking, which is tough, but we're working on it.
Yeah.
In philosophy, a category error. What'd you say?
That's why we're practicing. Sorry.
Yes. In philosophy, a category error, also known as a category mistake, happens when we take an idea that belongs in one domain and force it into another. Asking, quote unquote, what color is justice or how heavy is time is meaningless because the categories are mismatched. This is not to say you don't personally associate a color with justice or a weight with time, just like how I associate specific songs with certain books I've read. I like to listen to music when I read. That I probably could have left that part out. But yeah, I think it's really interesting, and you should all go read the rest of it because it's really good. Very well written. And I don't say that lightly. I like when I read certain things, and I like when reading good writers. But it's just like trying to, like, when I say, this guy came up to me in the gym, which I was going to talk to you about before today, and he was doing an isometric. So I'm always just like I'm curious. It's like I'm like, so why the isometric? And then he kind of went on for like 10 to 15 minutes as if I had no idea like what I was talking about. I was like, this could have been a 15-second blurb as to like why you believe this is great. And then he was like, yeah, I know it doesn't show yet, but it'll show in a month from now. And I'm like, okay, I will believe it when I see it. But also, like, it's just funny when people, maybe I just give off the vibe that I'm very uninformed. That's how I look. But it's just interesting when people are like, it's the circadian rhythm. And maybe that was the missing piece for you, but it might not be the missing piece for, Jack Cruz. Tom Cruise? Not Tom Cruise. Jack Cruz, who's like sitting in the sun all day, every day. Like, clearly he probably doesn't need any more sunlight. But
exactly.
For me, Kathleen's in a somewhere area, but like maybe someone in Minnesota, they just really need to dial in their sunlight, or maybe they'd feel a lot better going to Mexico for a month in the winter and getting some sun for a week.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, even with me, I always approach it like, these were the things that I needed for my health. And obviously we focus a lot on the LEA and the micronutrient side of things because they were big things that I needed. But I also, used to not be able to handle sunlight. And sunlight was actually getting those 3 times outside a day and stuff. That was a big part of, my quote unquote healing and stuff too. And it's a constant part of me like staying healthy and stuff nowadays. But it wasn't the like big mover for me. And I also look at these things as like, what we do in Transform is like the kind of foundational pieces where it's like, okay, we kind of hit the 20% that gives the 80% in each of these domains. And then from there, we basically give people like a bunch of information of like, we know something about some of these things, like go off and explore, like, consider if this is the next thing you need to do. But I will say, for most people, most things clear up when they focus on this 20% that drives the 80%. And then from there, it's like, sure, if you want to find the other remaining 80% cause that drives the remaining 20% effect, that's great. So we're talking about the Pareto principle right here. That's great. But like, certain times of your life, you might not have the time, resources, etc. to do that. Like, I don't have the time to do that as a mom right now, right? Like, so I am perfectly happy with taking, I would say most of my days are really great, but I am perfectly happy with taking fewer great days to then spend more time with my sons and stuff like that, versus like, okay, I got to go do this, and then I got to go do this, then I got to go do this, because I'm, like checking all of that remaining 80% that I'm quote unquote missing and stuff. And then also just serving as a foundation, so then those other things can actually take effect in your body, right? Because at the end of the day, like, if you're not hitting the quote unquote theoretical RDAs averaged across the week, averaged across the month, like however you want to look at it, like, you are going to eventually end up in energy insufficiency, energy insufficiency and micronutrient insufficiency. So, do you get like straight up pellagra or beriberi? Potentially not, but at the same time, a lot of the like diagnoses we have nowadays very much resemble a lot of the symptoms that you see with, beriberi, pellagra, like scurvy, like, all of them. So it's like, do you really just have a micronutrient deficiency, and that's the reason that things are going on and stuff? So again, I look at these things, like, to like step back, I look at these things as foundational, and until you're accounting for them day in and day out on average, 80% of the time, doing these other things really just seem to detract from what actually drives your health forward and stuff. So
Yeah. Do you think so? Bringing this full circle, did we cover all of the original points you
we
brought up,
didn't.
by the way?
Not yet.
We didn't?
Not yet. So
Okay.
yeah. So
Okay.
number 3 is muscle retention and performance. So
I swear that's
basically,
number 4. That must have been number, because you said, okay, we'll go with it. Number 3. Number 4.
so
It's number 4.
basically, yeah, number 4, whichever one. So the next one, muscle retention and performance. So basically, we know, obviously, if you are a complete newbie lifter, and or you have a significant amount of weight to lose, it is very possible for you to still put on muscle mass as you are in, an LEA, an energy deficit, basically. So as you're in a cut. However, for the vast majority of people, most people are so under muscled that you really want to be at least at energy sufficiency, positive nitrogen balance, so that you are, putting on muscle, being able to build muscle, and then not only like being able to build muscle, but having the micronutrients, the energy, etc., necessary for you to sleep, so that you can actually consolidate, these movement patterns, etc. So you're actually like learning the skill of the movement, the lift or the pogo, or the plyometric, like whatever you're doing itself, so that you can become competent in them in order for them to actually make an effect on you. So yeah.
I'd probably say this every time, but you need the muscle to pull on the bones, which also creates the adaptations for bone density. And bone density is essentially like bone, very closely related to bone mass. So if you lose the muscle mass, you're probably going to lose the bone mass. Now, that there is a little bit of a caveat here, because if you're overweight, the muscle can substitute for the bone mass. But
Right.
if you want to be a
I mean,
healthy individual,
the fat mass
yes,
can
sorry,
substitute.
the fat mass
Yeah.
can substitute for the muscle mass, because you're still, like, that's why obese individuals tend to literally be bigger boned, the irony, because they're supporting a larger frame all the time. But if you want to lose the fat mass, then you need enough muscle mass to maintain the bone mass. And we see things like, I was at my roommate's softball or baseball game. They won the championship. Congratulations, Justin. He's probably not going to listen to this. But like, a lot of they're older individuals, and a lot of them aren't sprinting all of the time. And the rate of injury just skyrockets when you try and reach full speed. And especially if you don't do that consistently. So, a lot of what we talk about and focus on and transform, I like to think about as being capable. There's this whole
Yes.
hybrid athlete thing, but I like to be capable, and I think it's useful to have the idea that, like, I want to be able to sprint. In order to do that, you need to sprint consistently. unless you want to be like the 90-year-old that just sprints for the first time in 30 years and pulls every muscle in their body, which there's like that famous video that went viral a few years ago, which was super funny.
Yeah, there was a video recently going around Instagram of like um, a fantasy football league where like they like picked their draft order by like who could sprint the fastest or something, and like every single one of them like pulled a hamstring or something.
It's- I,
Um,
I heard about that. I didn't realize it was from a video because my friends and I were talking about that.
yeah, I'm pretty. Yeah, it was going around. I saw it briefly on Instagram, but the really fast about that. I look at it as like almost trying to get closer to how you were as a child. And then the most important thing is slowly build capacity. So just because you used to be able to do something does not mean you can do it right now. And you have to meet yourself where you are, where you're at, and build your capacity in order to do that. But like, with me, I've gotten to the point where like I chase my sons around the park and stuff like that, and I can, without having to really warm up, like can just like take off. Like obviously I'm not sprinting, but I can like take off. I can cut, like back when I was playing soccer and stuff, like, do all of that. Where before I definitely could not do that in my like mid 20s because again of insufficient energy sufficiency and just like being so detrained from like all the rhabdo and stuff that I was having that like it was just not going to be possible. But and then you see like all the other parents where they're just like, you can tell they're just like not in energy sufficiency, and whether it's a macro issue, a calorie issue, a micro issue, a sleep issue, a sunlight issue, like whatever, but they're just like sitting on the park bench just like hunched over, like barely, like really dragging. And I don't want to say like all the parents, because obviously there are some that, run around with their children and play with them and stuff too. But it's like, if we could just get people back there, like how I just always wonder, like, how Ray would always talk about how like politics and societal makeup and all of that stuff like really go with like energy metabolism and stuff. Like you definitely see this, so I always wonder. But yeah. So, anyways,
Interesting.
a maintenance. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I had not heard him speak to that as much. That is, will have to look up what he said.
Okay, yeah, I think it's I'll have to find them and I'll send them to you. But anyways,
Is it
so
like
with
political?
your,
Is it like political leanings though, or like just like how people view politics?
um, I mean, he did talk a little bit about like political leanings and stuff, but more so like how society functions and operates when someone is like at sufficient in a sufficient energy state. Because like his whole thing, like sufficient energy creating order. Well, then this eventually so like starts, obviously the mitochondria, then to the cell, like then to the organ, then to the human individual, and then that eventually permeates outwards and stuff. So it just becomes like a manifestation of the actual like energetic state of of the person. So like you can have like the torpor state where like you're basically in like a hibernating mode, or you can have this like excessive excitability, but not because like of true energy, but because you're like running off of glutamate and estrogen and adrenaline and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
um so yeah, so you're in this like frantic excitability state,
Mhm. Kind of
almost
like
like
the like my old boss put this to me, and I really liked how he put it. Like, some people believe in a state of scarcity versus abundance,
right,
and so
right,
like, the high
infinite
metabolism
person.
is like they're yes, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Almost like a clonus, like yeah, rigor mort like before rigor mortis state in a way, where like you're firing so quickly that it eventually like, or if you're like electrocuted and like you're basically just like stuck because the muscles are like trying to fire so quickly because the amount of action potential is basically going through them. So yeah, so being at energy sufficiency, being at maintenance, some people need to be in a small surplus, or even some people find that they do better in a slightly higher surplus, can be crucial, like very, very helpful for putting on muscle. And it does seem like, a solid like 2 to 3 years of like a really solid progressive overload program, not cutting, or like if you do cut, it's like just a very small, like short, like 2 week stint to like regain some insulin sensitivity, etc. It does seem like that is just really crucial. I mean, I don't know. We'll see if that pans out. That's the path I'm on right now. So I'm almost a year into this. So, I definitely plan to do it at least another year, if not another year after that, and then see where I'm at. But I was at first planning to cut after 1 year, and I'm like, nope, I feel so good. I'm actually finally putting it back on muscle again and stuff. I like feel like I'm finally like re-putting back on the muscle I had when I used to Olympic lift and stuff. And so I'm like, I want to see how far I can take this, and then from there, like cut and basically see, what's quote unquote underneath everything. So,
Yeah,
um,
under the hood. Yeah, you'll never
yeah.
see it because Kathleen wears very modest clothing, but she's looking yoked these days. She posted a picture in Transform, and I was like, hot diggity. Hey, she's got some biceps going on there.
Yeah,
Um,
shoulders and biceps and like upper back and stuff. There's always been strong points, but thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
So next is psychological and behavioral health. We haven't got into this with the MSc yet, but we are planning on October to re-enter. Ash and myself are going to start going back to the MSc again, and the next section is all about psychological and behavioral health and stuff. So I think that will be a really helpful one. But like, not only do you have like quote unquote food noise, which I think, because of the rise of GLP-1s and stuff, I do think that there's been this like overemphasis on food noise. And I think that a lot of people think they have food noise, but they really don't. It's like not true actual food noise. But there is the issue with food noise. There's the issue with obviously the binge restrict cycle, so the undereat overeat cycle. But then also you do see issues with anxiety, depression, all of these things when you're in an insufficient energy state. So and like sleep issues, which then like causes all of these other psycho-emotional issues and stuff. So and then just like adherence, like your diet adherence just like falling through the floor because you're just like hungry. um, so when you return to maintenance, a lot again because of restoring micronutrients, restoring amino acids, like all of these things can like actually come back to where they need to be again. And plus we see all the time where a lot of people are like really food focused in Transform, and then as like we go through the first phase, like they all of a sudden stop becoming so food focused, and it's like I can actually like go live my life because I'm not thinking about like what am I gonna eat? Can I eat this food? Is this like a good or a quote unquote bad food? Did so and so influencer say I can have this week? Like all of these things. Like they objectively like look at, okay, right now, is this food an objective positive for me? If it is, great, okay. And like, it's working me towards my goal and stuff. And so a lot of those things like really clear up, which is really always amazing to see.
Yeah. Okay, to sum up this argument, I just want to say that a lot of these things are interrelated. So like the muscle mass plays with the hormones play with the muscle mass. Like it's very bidirectional with all of these things. We kind of categorize them into a number of steps. No one will ever know how many, but they were like they're all not as separate as like they can be made to believe.
Yeah, yeah. And the last thing too about, this in relation to cutting is we've talked about this before, but like say you have 40 pounds to lose. If you're going to lose 40 pounds all in a row, that's going to be 40 to 80 weeks if you follow the conventional, 0.5 to 1 pound drop per week versus and 40 to 80 weeks of like not hitting those theoretical RDAs, or if you are, you're being like hyper specific with your food choices, depending upon your deficit, of course. Not being potentially a positive nitrogen balance, not putting on muscle mass, like, all of these things, right? And so, for like long-term fat loss sustainability, it can be really important to come back to maintenance, be at maintenance for as long as possible, and then, re-enter into your fat loss phase again. And then also too, just like practicing maintenance, because most people know how to lose fat. The issue is they don't know how to maintain it and just be at maintenance for the rest of their life once they're there. And that's the hard thing.
Yeah. So why do you disagree or have a different perspective, at least, with Lyle and I think Brandon DeCruz? I don't want to speak for them, but both of them are advocates seemingly for doing like an RFL, which I didn't realize how crazy of a deficit that is, but like a crazy deficit a few days a week and then having other maintenance days in order to kind of make maintenance easy, at least pragmatically, rather than we are huge advocates for just maintaining a higher calorie load all the time.
Yeah. So I do think Brandon is a little bit like he has his primer phase or like metabolic restoration phase and stuff. So he's definitely for, maintenance um and I think like trying to push maintenance as high as possible, maybe not as like far as we're trying to go, but like definitely trying to like get people back up there so that when it does come time for a cut, it makes more sense. But it does seem like, and also like, to give Lyle for sure the benefit of the doubt, like his protein sparing modified fast, his like rapid fat loss, like that's not the only way that he has. It's just like one of the tools that he has, and people do really well with it. And so that's why he does that. But like, in general, I think people, they look at an obese individual and they just think, well, you just need to get the fat off. And so you just need to go into caloric deficit. It doesn't matter where you're starting at. But again, though, I do see a lot of people in the like this microcosm of an industry shifting, and there's a lot more people that are focused on these like pre-phases and stuff, which I think is good and important. But there there is also still a lot of people that will just immediately put you in a cut and have no consideration for current, food focus, no consideration for micronutrients, like, all of this stuff. The whole like Twinkie diet where it's like, okay, as long as you're just, you know, eating very small amounts of calories basically, like you'll be fine. But with things like the Twinkie diet, and like I always find it's the people that this is the first time they're actually dieting that those things work, because they haven't drawn down on their micronutrient stores, like they haven't created negative metabolic adaptations when it comes to neats, like all of this stuff. So you usually don't see like repeat dieters be successful with things like that. So did that answer your question? I mean,
But
you know,
so I would say that's a bit more extreme than them just advocating for, like, let's say with the context of Transform, we have like 6 maintenance day, he's in 1 calorie deficit day, to help people have a little bit more freedom on the weekends.
yeah. So I think this goes back to the podcast that we did about the 4 low energy availability types. I know
Yeah.
that research continues to show that there's no difference in fat loss, like as long as, you get sufficient protein throughout the day and you get the calories throughout the day and stuff. But there might be there might not be any difference, but when it comes to like someone's subjective experience, and again, this could be self-selection bias, it could be survivorship bias, it could just be the kind of people we attract, right? It does seem like making sure you have macronutrients, mostly split macronutrients, coming in throughout the day. And when it comes to absorption of micronutrients, it does seem like the transporters reach saturation, and so you wouldn't want to just have like one meal where you get like all of your potassium, right? Because like it does again seem like the transporters do reach saturation, and so getting them throughout the day does seem to be important. So that's why, and obviously people do a lot of like carb cycling, and like yes, maybe these things for the individual might help, but again, for the vast majority of people that we work with, they just seem to do better when we keep everything the same, split day in and day out. We don't do high days, we don't do low days, we don't do like different intermittent fasting regimens and stuff like that. It's just these are our calories for the week. Next week we either stay the same or increase. These are our calories for calories and macros for the week. Focusing on building the micronutrients so you're not hitting them and stuff like that. So yeah, so we just continue to find, I personally do better that way as well, so I'll definitely throw in the anecdote there. But again, I do recognize that maybe the people that they work with, it is psychologically more easy for them to do it that way.
Yeah.
But at the same time too, I always wonder, like, if you just spent some time building up your calories, then all of a sudden those quote unquote high days are just like your normal day, or like they
Yeah.
become your low day, right? And so then you can just evenly split throughout the week.
Yeah. The biggest thing I think too would probably be, it's a lot harder to induce that positive metabolic adaptation without having a more even split of calories.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, just
And
from like a subjective standpoint, like if you're not taking in, food throughout the day when you're like most active and stuff, like you're probably not gonna have a lot of energy in order to like be most active. And then like if you're not getting enough food, you know, depending upon when you need it before going to sleep, you're probably not going to have the best sleep. And then you're just like kicking the bucket down, and you just put
Yeah.
yourself more and more in a hole, basically.
Yeah. I do think it could be like a pragmatic strategy, but ideally not a weekly one. Like maybe like a day or two before a vacation or like before the holidays. And the issue with it too, I think psychologically you're just gonna be like, oh, I can eat whatever I want this weekend. And I
Right.
know for me, like he said, you're gonna be like a 1,500 calorie deficit with RFL. I can eat 1,500 calories so easily. And if like, I don't even want to talk about it. It's not even
Yeah.
worth talking about it. And
Yeah.
he was like, yeah, so I'm just in a calorie deficit 4 days a week. I was like, wow, that sounds miserable. Now, obviously for him and his goals, that's great. But for me, I do think it is so much more useful. And, the goal with all of this is eventually that you no longer need to hear Kathleen and I talk about nutrition because you're kind of bored and you've got the the main stuff dialed in and you can kind of just like coast.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I also just think it puts people in this under eat overeat cycle, because it put me there, right? I put
Yeah.
myself there, following these types of things, and that just doesn't ever, in my opinion, end up well. But again, some people, they do really well with it, and so I don't want to like discount their experience and stuff, but I just think that we continue to find over and over again, especially with like the general population, if we can spend some time getting their calories up as high as possible, to the point where they're like, okay, I'm good. Like eventually you get to the point where you're like, okay, I just don't really want to eat anymore. Like I'm good with where we're at and stuff like that, and that's perfectly okay. But like get the calories up until the person is subjectively and objectively happy with them, and they're hitting the theoretical RDAs. Again, if you're averaging it across the day versus the week, like at the end of the day, it kind of washes out, but like you do want to be getting them. Like it is important to be getting them in some length of time, especially with like the water solubles. Like, yes, we do have some storage ability for them, but like really depending upon which one, like maybe a month. And so, it's like, okay, you at least need to be getting these, sufficiently throughout the month and stuff. Um, but yeah, again, I just think that for most of the general population, we just see big improvements doing it that way versus, because like I could see, and we talked about this, like over time doing it that way, you get, because of the faster effect, for lack of a better word, of the negative metabolic adaptations. So on that like really low day, you're accumulating more negative metabolic adaptations than you are on the normal days, or even slightly higher days of positive metabolic adaptations. So eventually you end up in a net negative situation. And so I think, that is also a reason why. But again, I think it also just goes, is Lyle working with someone that's getting ready to step on a bodybuilding stage versus is he, working with someone that, wants to lose baby weight, for example, is something like that. So I think it always depends upon, again, categories, right? What category are you in? Just because we talk about tracking macros using Chronometer doesn't mean that's going to apply to you. Like so many people, if your health is solid, if you're maintaining your weight, if you're able to put on muscle mass and crush your athletic endeavors, like you might not need to track using Chronometer, right? Like,
Yeah.
so always like it always needs to have some amount of like filtering by the individual, and I understand that can be really difficult, especially when like you have all these subject matter experts being like, this is what you need. But you know you don't need it. Figure out what category you're in, basically.
Yeah. I responded to another tweet today. Someone talking about them giving up weightlifting for gymnastics, calisthenics, and I was like, dude, I like, why do they put it on my feed every time? It's like this is all the same thing. Like it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
But uh, I digress. I think that's a great way to wrap things up. Of course, I got a little rant in there at the end.
No,
um,
thank you.
but Kathleen, really appreciate you for coming on and taking the time. It is late here. So thank you for taking the time at night as well. Throwing off your circadian rhythm. We'll probably be hibernating for next week in order to recover from these blue lights that are in our eyes, but maybe we'll survive. If there's no podcast, you will all know why if this is the last one. Awesome.
we're robust enough. I look at it as like when you are able to control the controllables, that's when you get the positive adaptation, so you become more robust for the times that you're not necessarily able to control the controllables. So over time, you should be able to handle, more than you can.
Awesome. Till next time, guys. Be good.